And it's amazing. They go back over the data and find little bits of information that show how Ed Sullivan made millions of people happy every Sunday night. However, something that occurred in 1955 caused him to lose it. Witnesses couldn't believe the comments that came out of Sullivan's mouth when a teenage musician modified one of the songs. His carefully constructed image was ruined by a racial insult he used. The altercation nearly descended into violence. They had to be separated by staff. For many years, no one discussed it. The musician was permanently barred. However, his performance on live television that evening altered the course of rock and roll. Ed Sullivan was born in Harlem, New York, on September 28, 1901, as one half of a twin set. Daniel, his twin brother, was ill from birth and lived for only a few months. Ed was the sole twin still alive, and his early years were marred by the loss. He was influenced even as a boy by a sense of emptiness and a silent grief. Peter and Elizabeth, his Irish parents, had a large family. Only 5 of the 8 children, including Ed, made it through infancy. The home was simultaneously alive and grieving. Another tragedy struck while Ed was only 5 years old. The loss of his infant sister devastated the family once more. The pain was too much for Elizabeth to bear any longer. She made the decision that they would relocate to the small town of Portchester, which is located north of Harlem. There was more peace and quiet in Portchester. Ed never truly moved on from the losses, despite his parents' hopes that the shift would aid in their recovery. Ed learned to live with grief even as a young lad. Ed lived in spite of this, and was frequently referred to as the miracle child. He was raised surrounded by many ethnicities and musical genres, because he was born into a neighborhood where Jewish and Irish families coexisted. Ed watched as horse-drawn carriages gave way to cars. Only 5 of the 8 children, including him, survived past infancy. Life was a constant reminder of its frailty. He was cherished by his parents, particularly his mother. He was a miracle to them. Music helped, but grief was always present in the house. The Sullivans filled the rooms with their collective singing around the piano. They used music as a coping mechanism. Ed would never be able to break the habit. He would still recall those early days, even as a well-known television host, and how a song could lighten difficult situations. Ed also started to exhibit his need for control as he got older. He was a standout athlete in high school. 12 sports letters were awarded to him between 1916 and 1919. He was a hard-charging halfback on the football field, a speedy guard on the basketball court, an incredibly quick sprinter on the track. But as a catcher and captain, baseball was where he really excelled. He was formed by these athletics. They helped him develop his discipline and leadership skills. He also enjoyed taking charge. As the baseball team's captain, Ed instructed his colleagues on where to stand and how to play. His reputation grew along with his championships. He gained a sense of power from that function, which would be even more important later in his career. Ed fled to Chicago at the age of 17 in an attempt to join the Navy when America entered World War I. However, they sent him home since he was too young and without documentation. That failed attempt demonstrated his audacity. It also steered him in a different direction. Ed had learned to write by then, too. In school, he edited the school newspaper and published sports columns. He was hired by the Portchester Daily Item shortly after graduating. Ed enjoyed every bit of it, and they paid him $1 for each article. It was the beginning of his journalism career, which would later lead him to the New York Evening Graphic, the Associated Press, the Hartford Post, and the New York Evening Mail. His passions had always been writing and sports, which helped him get ready for a far larger platform. Ed learned about fairness from sports as well. He played with black athletes as a child without giving it much thought. He found it instinctive. He never found it odd when he visited teams with black players in Connecticut for games. He never wavered in his conviction in equality, even when other presenters refused to offer black performers a platform. Ed Sullivan would later do so when he had his own television program. Ed Sullivan believed that joining the Hartford Post in 1919 would be a significant leap in his career. He was hoping for new prospects at a larger publication, after coming from the Portchester Daily Item. But that ambition was quickly derailed. Before he had a chance to settle there, he lost his job when the Hartford Post folded in his first week of employment. Newspapers were doing very well at the time, so it was an unexpected and unfortunate setback. Rarely do papers close their doors after a few days. When Sullivan saw how unstable the newspaper industry could be, he had to start the job search anew. This did not, however, slow him down. Rather, it strengthened his resolve to continue. Early on, the brief and agonizing lesson molded his perseverance and determination. After the Hartford Post failed, Sullivan was able to get back up and work as a sports reporter for the New York Evening Mail. However, that paper too stopped publishing in 1923. This was the start of a difficult time during which he moved from failing newspaper to newspaper. He alternated between the New York Bulletin, the Morning World, the Morning Telegraph, the Philadelphia Bulletin, the Associated Press, and the Leader between 1923 and 1927. He had to hunt for a new job every time one paper failed. The majority of people would have given up during this difficult cycle. Sullivan just wouldn't give up. Every job turned into an opportunity to expand his network and sharpen his talents. Even though it was unpredictable and draining, it demonstrated his genuine love for journalism. Particularly significant were the years spent with the Associated Press. One of the most reputable news outlets in the world at the time was the Associated Press. Sullivan continued to freelance for other publications, such as the Morning Telegraph and the Philadelphia Bulletin, but his position with the AP provided him with more significant assignments and national stories. Sullivan had experience covering everything from breaking news to sports during this time, which ended in 1927. He established a strong reputation as someone who could adapt and tell compelling stories, despite having to shift jobs frequently. He had established himself as a competent reporter by the time he left the AP. Sullivan made his second significant move in the same year. He began working as a sports journalist for the New York Evening Graphic in 1927. The Graphic had a reputation for daring, frequently scandalous stories, and was noisy and ostentatious. There, Sullivan flourished and advanced swiftly. He soon held his first steady leadership position as sports editor. He also met one of the most well-known gossip columnists of the era, Walter Winchell, at the Graphic. In 1929, Winchell left for the Daily Mirror, and Sullivan took over as the Graphic's columnist for Broadway. That piece provided him a new type of influence and exposed him to the entertainment industry. Sullivan was already well known by the time the firm dissolved in 1932. He started writing Broadway columns for the New York Daily News in 1932. At that point, he started writing Little Old New York, his well-known column. It was checked daily by readers for 42 years until 1974. Sullivan wrote on the city's biggest stars' private lives, Broadway productions, and well-known actors. His voice was fair, sharp, and constantly inside the action, which is why people adored it. Someone may become famous overnight with only one remark from Sullivan. In order for readers outside of New York to follow the drama, his column was also syndicated. Sullivan adjusted to every new development in the entertainment industry, year after year. He remained at the top because of that. Sullivan worked as a talent scout as well. There was more to Little Old New York than rumors. It served as the major break for aspiring actors and performers. Sullivan had the ability to spot talent before anyone else did. His column may launch a career with just one encouraging remark. However, if he didn't like someone, a single comment could destroy a person's reputation. Producers and actors realized that one line could determine the fate of their program, so they looked at his column every morning. Sullivan was not merely a news reporter. He was molding it. He was present at all the theatrical openings and large celebrations outside the newspaper offices. Sullivan was present wherever something occurred. However, New York's nightlife also served as a battlefield. Sullivan opened an establishment at the renowned El Morocco Club. His unofficial headquarters were there. Walter Winchell, his opponent, held court at the Stork Club across town. In these glamorous places where politicians and movie stars spend their evenings, both men vied for attention. The contest included all of the well-known faces that entered. Winchell's store was well known for its select clientele and stringent door policy. El Morocco by Sullivan was well known for its glitz and strength. Everyone was aware of the competition between these two columnists, who controlled New York's nightlife. In the city, it became one of the most talked about stories. A person's reputation could be made or broken by their attendance at either club, and Sullivan wasn't content to merely write. He made the same decision as Winchell to dominate radio. His first radio program, The Ed Sullivan Show, debuted on CBS in 1932. He gained new fans and well-known guests like George M. Cohan and Jack Benny, thanks to that show. With Ed Sullivan Variety in 1941, Ed Sullivan Entertains from 1943 to 1944, and Ed Sullivan's Pipelines in 1946, Sullivan continued to host. His name spread into more homes with each show. For him, radio was ideal. It allowed him to communicate showbiz rumors more quickly and with a larger audience. Because he was a familiar voice, people started to trust him. He could do more than compose, as demonstrated by radio. In 1948, CBS made a bold decision. They chose Ed Sullivan to host Toast of the Town, their new Sunday night variety show. Sullivan had no prior TV experience and was a newspaper columnist. Producer Marlo Lewis of CBS believed that Sullivan's straightforward approach may be effective. Sullivan was uncertain. "Everything they're promising to do is something I've already done," he laughed. With a meager $1.75 budget, the first program broadcast on June 20, 1948. Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin received only $200 for their appearances. Sponsors were afraid. CBS CEO William Paley had faith in him, despite executives' concerns that he wasn't showy enough. Sullivan worked hard to secure high-profile guests and helped the show become a success for over 2 decades. That achievement wasn't painless. He was despised by critics. His wooden delivery struck them as terrible. He had no personality at all, according to Harriet Van Horn. He was described as hopeless, stiff, and awkward by other critics. It was personal to Sullivan. He even once sent Van Horn a brief scathing letter, but his family continued to observe. Alan King even made a joke about Sullivan doing nothing but doing it better than anyone else. Sullivan had to learn to accept it. He allowed comedians to mimic him. His popularity increased as a result. The fact that he could make fun of himself pleased the audience. Despite the mockery of critics, audiences continued to return. Sullivan's peculiar manner became a defining characteristic of the show. He appeared anxious on camera. He always slouched his shoulders. He had a nasal voice. He was suspected of having Bell's palsy. His smile was likened by Time magazine as a person sucking a lemon. However, he was perfectly okay. He received a lot of letters complimenting his bravery. His characteristic wooden moves were imitated by comedians. This photograph was never contested by Sullivan. He even welcomed it. He became one of the most adored personalities in entertainment because of his humor and honesty. The program had relocated to CBS, Studio 50, at 1697 Broadway by 1953. Built in 1927, it was an old theater. The interior was opulent, with stained glass and a Gothic ceiling. Fitting cameras and equipment inside required effort. To prevent interference, even the adjoining subway had to be protected. This theater was a favorite of Sullivan's. In 1967, CBS changed its name to the Ed Sullivan Theater to commemorate 20 years of broadcasting. For a TV personality, that was an uncommon accolade. That theater still stands today. Most people know it because of Sullivan and the other celebrities who performed there. But David Letterman and Stephen Colbert would later call it home. Initially, the show was still referred to as Toast of the Town. This, in Sullivan's opinion, did not adequately acknowledge him. It was already perceived by audiences as his show. CBS changed its name to The Ed Sullivan Show on September 25, 1955. Sullivan cared about that. It demonstrated his status as one of the most influential guys on TV. He would include Elvis Presley a year later. A total of 60 million people watched Elvis. At the time, that was a TV record. That enormous crowd and the new moniker solidified Sullivan's reputation for all time. However, working with Sullivan wasn't always simple. Backstage on November 20, 1955, was Bo Diddley. Sullivan heard him perform Tennessee Ernie Ford's smash hit, 16 Tons. In just 3 weeks, that song had sold over 1 million copies. Diddley was instructed to play it by Sullivan. Diddley presumably consented because he believed it would advance his career. However, he believed he was destined to do both when he saw cards reading Bo Diddley 16 Tons, Live. Instead, he decided to play Bo Diddley, his own tune. One of the most rebellious moments in early TV history was brought about by that decision. Diddley appeared on an R&B show. The audience erupted when he sang his own song. Sullivan was enraged. Diddley left a lasting effect with his unadulterated energy and well-known rhythm. For the first time, many Americans heard that contagious Bo Diddley beat. Despite just lasting 2 minutes, it had a lasting impact on rock and roll. Sullivan was upset when the cameras ceased. At Diddley, he screamed. Diddley and witnesses claimed that Sullivan even referred to him as the first black boy to ever betray him. That was a startling act of racism. Although Sullivan had previously advocated for black artists, his bias and irritability were exposed here. The altercation was intense. They had to be restrained by staff. The altercation almost descended into violence. Diddley felt the need to strike Sullivan. Diddley's management made an effort to soothe him. That's Ed Sullivan, cautioned the manager. Diddley was unconcerned. Sullivan told him that he'd never work on TV again. You won't last 6 months, Sullivan said. Diddley was prohibited from going back. According to his daughter Betty, Ed Sullivan was adored by millions of people on television. But his life has been much different. According to her, her father was infamously irascible over the tiniest things. Ed was cool and polite in public. He was easily enraged in private. At home, Betty remembered an instance where Ed had yelled and slammed doors after a minor argument. Family members learned to avoid him at all costs. They had no idea what could trigger him. He hardly ever displayed this temper on TV. It remained concealed under the well-known courteous grin. However, it was very real at home, and those who loved him had to deal with this erratic side on a daily basis. Additionally, Betty explained that Ed was very different from his public image. Because of his show, many perceived him as gregarious and extroverted. When the cameras were not rolling, he was actually rather introverted. He enjoyed being by himself. He would frequently hide in his dressing room after a broadcast rather than celebrating or interacting with guests. He might read the newspaper or watch TV in silence for hours even at home. This was not a passing mood. He was just naturally that way. Even his coworkers occasionally perceived him as distant or frigid, due to the stark contrast between his public persona as a gregarious presenter and his private life as a reclusive man. His concerns at the height of the Cold War had a darker aspect as well. One of Betty's stories concerned Ed's growing conviction that her partner had communist sympathies. It occurred somewhere in the late 1950s or early 1960s, when America was gripped by a widespread fear of communism. Betty was interrogated by Ed regarding the boy's past. He thought of kicking him out of the house. He believed his daughter was involved with a subversive, so he even sought counsel from others. There was absolutely no evidence to support this baseless suspicion. Even Ed Sullivan, who openly advocated for civil rights and invited African American artists to perform on his show, was unable to avoid the paranoia of the day. Ed was also a man who kept his feelings to himself. According to Rob Precht, his grandson, Ed seldom ever expressed affection or discussed emotions. Rob thought Ed had put up this emotional facade to cover up his suffering. Ed's sister died when she was a little girl, and his twin brother died when he was a baby. He became cautious about his emotions as a result of these losses. He held himself back and maintained a stern demeanor, even as an adult. Rob believed that Ed's chilly demeanor toward strangers, and even certain family members, was partly due to this. He was a man who felt more than he could express, though, beneath that tough veneer. It influenced his personality and how he responded to the demands of celebrity. His interactions with performers also revealed the same conflict between his private conduct and public persona. The Doors were scheduled to perform live on his show on September 17, 1967. The producers instructed them to alter a line in Light My Fire before they took the stage. They believed that the word higher implied drug use, so they wanted it removed. The musicians told the producers what they wanted to hear during rehearsal by nodding and agreeing. However, Jim Morrison informed the others that they would not be making any changes as soon as they left the room. The rest of the band, despite their nervousness, supported him. I responded, "Fuck it. Let's do it the way that we do it." Later, guitarist Robbie Kager stated, "I thought they were kidding." They decided they would not back down. The program was live that night, and Ed introduced them cordially as usual. After they played one song, they began Light My Fire, and the cameras rolled. The audience loved Morrison's rendition of Girl, We Couldn't Get Much Higher. Backstage, the atmosphere was completely different. The producers were furious, and after the show, Ed Sullivan himself entered their dressing room. According to witnesses, he was enraged and swore at them, telling them that they had betrayed the show's and the network's trust. Millions of people were watching. When someone told the band they would never play on the show again, Jim Morrison famously responded, "But we just did." That one sentence perfectly captured the band's spirit. They had achieved their goal. The band was informed that all future appearances were canceled, but they were unfazed. Even decades later, that moment continues to reverberate in interviews, documentaries, and films. The Rolling Stones were scheduled to perform their new single, Let's Spend the Night Together, on The Ed Sullivan Show on January 15, 1967. They had been on one of the biggest platforms in America, and they had remained true to themselves. But the title was too suggestive for family TV, according to the show's CBS producers, who told the band to change the lyrics or stop altogether. The Stones complied under pressure, singing Let's Spend Some Time Together, which was a big deal at the time because American television was strict and they felt the original lyrics were too rebellious. The Stones agreed, but they weren't happy. The incident went viral, demonstrating the conflict between rock music and TV censorship. and the influence of television on artists. Radio stations followed suit, with many bleeping the word night or refusing to play the song at all, which negatively impacted the song's success in America. The Stones, on the other hand, had a rebellious image and were already known for pushing boundaries. Their controversial lip sync on Sunday night at the London Palladium added to their reputation. The Ed Sullivan moment remained in everyone's memory as one of the most famous censorship battles in rock history. And the UK didn't care because the song wasn't censored there. In order to express his disapproval of the change, Mick Jagger made a point during the performance. Every time he sang, "Let's spend some time together," he rolled his eyes at the camera. It was a sarcastic gesture, but it was noticeable to the audience and the producers alike. In contrast to Jim Morrison of The Doors, who refused to alter his lyrics and was banned, the Stones had agreed to alter the lyrics, but maintained their spirit. And Mick's eye rolls demonstrated that they could adhere to the rules, while still making fun of them. The eye rolls gained notoriety as a silent form of protest. It was a memorable moment, and even now, people talk about those few seconds as a perfect example of how a band could rebel without breaking the rules. A few years prior, there had been another famous fight with Ed Sullivan. Some people believed this was prearranged, while others believed it was just Mick being himself. After President Lyndon B. Johnson's live announcement interrupted comedian Jackie Mason's performance on October 19, 1964, Sullivan held up 2 fingers off screen to inform Mason that he had 2 minutes remaining. Mason then started making jokes about fingers, pointing at people and saying, "Here's a finger for you and a finger for you." Mason, in Sullivan's opinion, was gesturing indecently toward him. Mason's thumb appeared to Sullivan to be a middle finger. Sullivan was enraged. He canceled Mason's 6-appearance contract after the show. At the time, that deal was for $45,000, which is more than $450,000 today. Mason was erratic and ill, Sullivan told the media. No one took Mason's denial that he had ever flipped Sullivan off seriously. Mason lost his lawsuit against Sullivan for lying. The story was widely reported by the media. Mason's career suffered greatly. Sullivan was strong. If you fought with him, you would lose your job. Mason was prohibited from watching most TV. His recovery took nearly 2 decades. Mason's reputation remained tarnished, even after Sullivan expressed regret and allowed him to return to the show. He was known as the comedian who made a mistake on live television. He was deemed too dangerous to book by the producers. Mason was made to perform biting sections in little clubs. He didn't revive his career till years later. Everyone was still aware of the finger incident at that time. Crossing someone like Sullivan was a hard lesson. Sullivan did more than host. He guarded the gate. A career could be ruined if you disagree with him. Additionally, Sullivan had tight rules on who might appear on his show. His regulations had to be followed by many artists. Elvis Presley and other celebrities had to film from the waist up, and what was appropriate was frequently decided by Sullivan. He did, however, have a side that few anticipated. He booked more black performers than most hosts at the time, despite his tendency to be gruff and domineering. Sullivan provided a nationwide platform for African American musicians, dancers, and singers, beginning in 1948. Racism and segregation were still prevalent at the time. He was advised by certain sponsors to cease booking them. He was once instructed to stop by a Ford executive. He was ejected from the theater by Sullivan. Sullivan emphasized that talent was more important than prejudice. James Brown, the Supremes, the Temptations, Sammy Davis Jr., Ella Fitzgerald, and Louis Armstrong all appeared on his show. Coretta Scott King and other civil rights stalwarts also made an appearance. Sullivan took genuine chances. For that reason, he was adored by many. Others believed him to be deceitful. Behind the scenes, he had a reputation for blacklisting artists like Bo Diddley, who disobeyed him. He did more than others, however, to promote black talent on screen. For 23 years, Sullivan's show continued to air. From June 20, 1948 to June 6, 1971, it was broadcast on CBS. More than 1,000 episodes, that is. Millions of Americans watched every Sunday. Everyone from the Beatles to Elvis Presley was introduced to them by Sullivan. Also performing were comedians Carol Burnett and Richard Pryor. On February 9, 1964, around 73 million people attended the Beatles' performance. At the time, that was a record. Sullivan's rigorous control was well known. Only the waist of Elvis was seen. The words have to be altered by the Rolling Stones. Nevertheless, a career could be made or broken by performing on Sullivan. The show's eventual cancellation by CBS in 1971 felt like the end of an era. After that, Sullivan himself didn't survive long. Sylvia, his wife, passed away on March 16, 1973. They met in 1926 and were married on April 28, 1930. At first, they kept their connection a secret because he was Catholic and she was Jewish. They even disclosed to her family that Ed Sullivan was Sullivan's real identity. In 1930, they finally eloped in City Hall. Elizabeth, their daughter, was born 8 months later. They were a team, the Sullivans. After each performance, Ed frequently received candid criticism from Sylvia. He was devastated when she passed away in 1973. Sullivan received a diagnosis of esophageal cancer a year later. His family chose not to be completely honest with him. They believed it would cause him too much distress. Sullivan was gone in a matter of weeks. At age 73, he passed away on October 13, 1974. St. Patrick's Cathedral hosted his funeral. Sullivan didn't remember who he was. Paul McCartney later recounted when he saw him. By then, Sullivan was a completely different person. Years later, his grandson Rob and daughter Betty talked of Sullivan's domineering nature. In 1952, Betty wed Bob Pree, the producer of the show. She had witnessed firsthand how Ed handled every little detail. Sullivan's obsession with perfection made him well known. His family was affected as well. Rob related tales of Sullivan's kindness and toughness. The same family-loving man also outlawed entertainers who offended him. The other side of a man who most people assumed was just a stiff TV personality was revealed by these revelations. Sullivan can be angry one minute and warm the next. Only his family truly saw this side of him, despite the fact that millions watched him every Sunday. Long after the cameras had stopped, they could still feel it.